Hello everyone, welcome to another very exciting tutorial. Today we're going to be talking about mocking and basically what it means, how we can use it, and what it means in the context of front-end applications. So mocking in general means simulating or basically imitating an action, right? In the context of this tutorial, we're talking about mocking backend APIs. So many times you're working in a team, so you have a backend developer or front-end developer, or you're working in an organization that has a couple of teams, basically one team working on a backend and one team working on a front end. And if you're like me, I usually start my projects from the design going forward and then going to the backend. And usually I start doing the front end applications. So many times it's a good idea to be able to kind of deliver a front-end application without being so much dependent on the backend API. So let's say, you're a team, you decide on an API that represents users of your application. So you have like a backend API that connects to a database, and that database, API based on the data in the database will return the list of users, right? So in this example, you'll see that our front-end application basically contains a table that represents the users of our application that has like name, username, country, and a bunch of other things. But we are interested in visualizing them in this table, right? So how are we going to go about doing parallel works? So basically what I mean is that you want to start developing your front end application without being so much dependent on the backend. So a backend team can go ahead and develop, what they need to develop, and in front end you basically want to develop something that ultimately when the backend team is done with what they need to provide you, it's just a simple change, right? So let's see what do I mean. Let's get started. I'm going to kotus.com, and then in the front end section, online editor, I'm gonna go ahead and create a container here. Within the container, I'll put a table, and I'm going to say t head, and then I'm gonna say tr/tr, and within the tr, I'm going to say th name, and then another th representing the username, and then ultimately we're gonna have uh, like a country, right? And then going ahead, creating a T body. Within the T body, we have a TR, and then we have a TD. Let's just for the sake of styling, let's say, the name is Mike, and let me just fix this. So we have a TD Mike, and then for the username, let's say Mike12, and then another TD for the country US. Going ahead and styling it a little bit, so container width 80%. Let's give it a margin of 40 pixel and auto to kind of center it. I'm going to style the table now, give it a width of 100%, and making sure that the text align is right. Then going ahead, sorry, I will just left. And then what am I going to do? Give it a border of 2 pixels, solid AAA. So we have some sort of a good looking table. I'm going to go ahead and maybe make sure that the table, let's add another row here, just for the sake of this tutorial. And going ahead and make sure that the table TD border top 1 pixel solid, maybe CCC. So we have some sort of like a border on top of these. Give it a padding of 10 pixel. Need to do the same for the username. So I'm going to say table th and table td. Let's give them a padding of 10 pixel. Looks better. Let's make it zebra strip. So I'm just going to say table t body tr for the children that are odd. Let's give it a background of maybe EEE, right? So we have some sort of a zebra stripping as well. or striping, what I'm going to do is also make sure that the table has border collapse and then collapse, right? All right, so we have a pretty much good looking table right now, at least for the sake of this tutorial. Now I'm going to switch to this layout and go ahead and try to make this in JavaScript, right? Because we're going to load the data from a backend API, so we need to dynamically generate this. So for now, I'm going to go ahead and remove these tables, these TRs. And in JavaScript, I'm going to create a reference tbody document.query selector. And then here, I'm just going to say table tbody, right? And then I'm going to create a data object, let's say users, since we talked about having users fetching them from the backend. And this users is an array. Within the array, we have objects. Each object has a name, let's say Mike, and then has a username, let's say Mike12, and let's say the country is US. And then we're gonna have, I'm just gonna copy this object. We're gonna have another object name, for example, Dan, and then the username is Dan123, and then the country is, let's say, UK, right? So now, what am I gonna do is I'm going to say users for each. I'm going to use the ES6 syntax now. If you're not familiar, I'm going to make a tutorial over what are the features of ES6s. But for now, instead of writing function like this and then pass the user here, I'm going to go ahead and use the ES6 syntax. So it's going to be user and then equal sign and the greater sign and then user. And then here, what am I going to do is I'm going to create a TR document.query selector tr, and I'm just going to say let's append it to our tbody. So tbody.append child and then tr. Now we need to loop over the users, which we did, and then loop over the objects here and add them as td, right? So just going to say, since this is an object, not an array, I'm just going to get the keys using object.keys and then the user. Since we get the user, each user here. For each user, I'm just going to say for each. And then this will be, let's call them field. And I'm going to create a td document.query selector td. And then I just say td.innerhtml is equal. So field here represents name, username, and country. So in order to get the value, since we have the user over here, I'm just going to say user and then the field that I need. And then ultimately I say tr append child td, right? I'm just going to make it correct. So uses t's. So basically for each users that we have over here, we loop over for each user. We create a tr document. Sorry, this shouldn't be query selector. Create element, and the same here. Create element, right? So now you can see that we dynamically generated the rows for this table. I hope you kind of understood what I did here. I used for each to loop over the users, and then within for each of those user objects that we get here, I basically created a TR and appended it, and then for each of the keys, since this is object now, for each of the keys within this object, I again looped and put field. The field represents the name, and then username, and then country, and then I got that value of that key from the user object and then appended it as a TD. All right, so now we know how we develop this. Now let's say we know that this is going to come from a backend API that is not yet developed. So the first thing is to come up with a contract with the backend team or a backend person as to how this API will look like, what are the inputs, what are the outputs, and after we agreed upon that contract, then we can easily start developing. So for example, I'm going to develop the front end application, and a colleague of mine or another team will start doing the backend API, knowing the contract, right? Basically, the agreement that we have. So, what is the agreement? Let's say the agreement is that we're going to have, I'm just going to put a comment here. We're going to have, for example, the server address and then slash users, right? And these users will ultimately return objects that contain name, username, and country, right? So that is our contract. So what am I going to do in front end is really interesting. What I'm going to do is create a user service. So I'm just going to call it user service, which is an object. And within this object contains a method, and that method is get users, right? So this is the syntax that we create a method within an object. So get users can initially return this object that we created. So if I copy this here and get rid of the users and just return this value, I'm going to indent it a little bit. So what this get users does is basically returning a list of objects, right? So now here, instead of this, since I already created a users, I'm just going to say users here now is user service dot get users, right? So you can see that it starts working. So I have a user service that has get users method. I call that, and the return of it is an array of the users, and then I loop over it and get it. So right now, the only thing I need to do is to change the implementation. So I'm kind of ready. I can even show this to, I don't know, users or customers or consumers of this application. And then when the backend is finished, I only need to change this portion of the code. So the rest pretty much will be the same. The next thing I want to say is that usually when you work with backend API, back these JavaScript libraries and specifically the fetch API that I talked about in previous tutorials is returning a promise, right? And what is a promise? Promise is an object that basically holds the fact that at some point, you're going to get a result, whether it's going to be an OK result or a reject result. So if your API call works, it's going to be a OK. And if it's not, it's going to be a reject. So I'm going to show you how you create a promise. So here, instead of returning this object like that, what am I going to do is basically saying that I want to return a new promise, right? And this promise has two parameters. One is resolve and the other one is reject, right? And then inside this function, I just going to say resolve and then pass this object that I have over here, right? So I'm just going to copy this like that. Going to indent it, and I'm going to get rid of this return. So now the get users of the user service return a promise. And as I told you, if I go ahead and say search for promise JavaScript, the first link is in MDN. So here you can see is the promise object represents the eventual completion or failure of an asynchronous operation and its resulting value. And asynchronous, obviously, calling a backend API will be asynchronous, right? So here, as you could see, I created a new promise that accepts a resolve and reject. And I basically say when this promise resolved, meaning that it returned the correct data, I want the data to be this, right? So now here, instead of doing it like this, I can just say user service dot get users, and since it's a promise, I'm going to use then method, and this then method has the result, which is users, right? And then I basically copy this code and paste it inside the ready. Isn't that cool? So now you can see that we not only created a mock, so basically this user service get users is a mock of the actual operation that should happen here, right? So now you can see that we get the results back, everything looks good, and I no longer need to change this piece of code. The only thing I need to change when the backend API is done is to change this piece of code, right? As easy as that. So let's say the backend API team has finished developing this code. So what am I going to do is going to I'm going to go here, create a, backend API using Node.js and Happy Framework. So let's create a directory called, let's call it Happy, let's call it backend API. And then in the backend API, I'm just going to create a project using npm init. Let's call it, let's just get the default values here. So now I have like a package.json, and I'm going to install the Happy framework, which is a framework for creating APIs in Node.js. So npm install Happy, it goes ahead and creates the Happy. Now I'm going to open this in the Visual Studio Code editor. So you can see in the package.json, we have, the definition of our project, but also the dependency over here. I'm going to create an index.js file. Inside that, I'm just going to say, in the index.js, I'm going to say const happy. I'm just going to require the Happy framework here, Happy. And then I would say const, I create the server, Happy server, passing an object. I want the host to be localhost, and then port, let's say 9000. And then I would say server that I'm going to create that route, right? So the route will be slash users. It's actually accepting an object, which the method is get, and then the path is slash users, and then I'm going to have a handler, and in this handler, uh, I'm going to return. So for example, here the backend API team calls the API. I'm not going to calls the well, basically queries the database for users table and returns the users, and then ultimately, you do some you know uh, post operations, making sure that you return the correct values out of that query. So here for now, I'm going back to the here, and I'm just going to return this object as if like this is the backend API call, right? So I'm just going to return this, and this is an array. Ultimately, I'm just going to say server dot start, right? And then I can say console log using object literal server started at, and then I can basically say server dot info dot URI, right? These are the specific. These are the Happy related, you know, configs that I'm writing here. So now if I do node index.js, while it says there is a problem here, let's fix that problem. It returns, I forgot to add the bracket here. So now if I run it, you see that it says server started at this. So if I go ahead in the browser and call this, you'll see that we get nothing. But if I say the resources user, we're going to get the results that we want. So as I said, let's say the backend team has finished implementing this method, and this is what it really returns. Now in the front end, where we develop the thing, you can see the only change that I need to do is this method, right? Let's say I'm just going to return. I'm going to use the fetch API of JavaScript to call the backend. So I would say return fetch. Now I know the address, so HTTP localhost port 9000 slash users, and then I get the response and then convert it to JSON. And this then function also returns a promise. So by this, if I go ahead in my application and enable the cores, so I'm just going to say routes cores true, going to go ahead and resolve the restart the server. So now if I just press, the load, I suspect the data will come from the backend, and this is already done. So you can even see it here. If I press refresh, you'll see that we call the backend API on this. It's a get method, and we get the results back. So you could really see how fast I could create the front end application without really being dependent on the backend API. By what? Mocking the functionality that I expect from the backend. So basically, this used to be the mocked get users from the backend, right? Right now, it's the actual implementation. It literally calls the backend API. But before that, if you remember, we could easily generate the mock data without even calling the backend. So I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. This is usually how I go about creating front-end applications. That is a new application. It needs a new backend API. We don't really waste time to wait for the backend API to be ready and then develop our code. We basically agree upon a contract with the with the backend team or a backend person. We agree on, okay, we're gonna have a slash users, and then the response will contain name, username, and country. So I hope again you enjoyed this tutorial. If you haven't subscribed to the channel, go ahead and do. We try to show all sort of things in front end and back end application development as well as full stack. I hope this tutorial helped you. If you have any questions or concerns, please put them in the description below. Uh, Sorry, in the comment section below. I'll put the link to this in the description as well, so you can go ahead and take a look at the code. And I wish you a very good day and night. See you next time.